Hi guys, hi, how's it going? How y'all doing today? Hopefully today finds you well. Today I am doing my No Pan Left Behind update for the third quarter of the year. These are all the pans that I was able to use to completion or partially touch throughout the last quarter. So all things July, August, and September is what we're talking about today. Then I'll share with you the totals and the numbers and all the things as well. But if that sounds like something that you're interested in, please keep on watching. For those of you new here, hi, my name is Donna. I'm a lover of all things high and colorful beauty and self-care. Ultimately, this is my self-care. I love to talk about makeup. That is why I am out here. And I'm hoping that if you love to talk about makeup, you find that this brings solace to your soul and the way it brings solace to mine, and that you'll want to subscribe before you go. And with that said, let's roll into this quarter three No Pan Left Behind update. So if you're new here, I have over 200 palettes available to me in my collection. It's somewhere around 210. And my ultimate goal in this No Pan Left Behind series-ish that I have going on in my channel is not to use every single one of my palettes by the end of the year, but to keep track of how many palettes I have in my collection and how often each palette is getting touched or used. I want to try to use every single palette in my collection every single year, but I know that that is likely not going to happen just because I have so many. However, I do want to track those that I am touching and those that maybe are not getting touched year over year over year in my collection. So I started this like No Pan Left Behind like journal where I set up all of the palettes that I own in my collection. As I bring some in, I put them in here. As I take them out through declutter or whatnot, I cross them off. But the reason why I started this is because I do a series on my channel called Palette Roulette. It's about palette reviews. Maybe should change the name of the review series. I don't know, but it's been Palette Roulette since I started it, I think like 5 years ago at this point. So it's gonna be what it's gonna be. But I realized that I was only using those palettes that I was reviewing in my palette collection. And now that I'm getting to a point where I'm almost done. I don't think I'll ever be done, let's be honest, because I purchase palettes a lot, but I'm almost done with all the palettes that I have in my drawer of shame, which will make it so that I don't have any palettes to review anymore. I need to use the other palettes in my collection as well. There's a reason why I have them in my collection. I've brought them in because I love the beauty of them all. So I also want to get some usage out of them. And what this tracking system does for me is it not only signifies for me that I am using the palettes that I am bringing into my collection, but it is also signaling to me which palettes I'm pulling for the most, which ones are getting the most love, and really also helps me understand that I have more than just the regular set that I pull from to get some usage out of them. So in quarter one, January, February, and March, I don't think I started like tracking until February. And the reason why I say that is because January and February are the same color. So I do think that from a palette roulette standpoint, I was able to know which palettes I went through in January, but then I started tracking usage in February of the other palettes in my collection. So January, February, and March, I had completed 9 palettes, No Pan Left Behind, meaning that I touched every single shadow in 9 different palettes, and then I had 4 that I had touched outside of those 9 different palettes. And I will be honest with you, those 9 palettes likely were only touched and gone through entirely because of my Palette Roulette series in which I'm reviewing palettes, which I'm okay with, but I want it to look like more, right? When I started doing Palette Roulette, I was doing a palette a week. So I was touching 52 palettes every single week and doing them No Pan Left Behind. And these days I like to spend a little bit more time with the palettes, but I'm also bringing in more than one palette to use because I like a little bit of variety. Like for instance, right now in my palette roulette, I have 3 palettes that I'm using no pan left behind style to come back to you and review those palettes. So I don't know where I was going with that statement, but I just want to get use. I just want to get use out of the palettes that are in my collection and get rid of the palettes that I'm just not drawn to using. And this gives me a bigger idea of what that is. Now, a lot of people, when they do no pan left behind, they draw palettes in that they're going to no pan left behind. I don't like doing it in that way because I am not forevermore going to be drawing palettes to utilize in my collection. I want them to be, for now at least, I want it to be genuine, a genuine connection to that palette to pull from it to use it in an eye look. So I don't pick specific palettes that I want to use except for as it pertains to my palette roulette series. In January, February, and March, I completed 9 palettes and I touched 4 additional palettes outside of that. In April, May, and June, I completed 12 additional palettes. And I think 3 of the ones that I was able to complete in those months were 3 of the 4 partial palettes that I pulled for in January, February, and March. I completed 12 palettes and pulled from 7 different partial palettes. In July, August, and September, which is the quarter 3 update, I was able to complete No Pan Left Behind, 11 new palettes, and I also touched 8 additional palettes besides those 11 completed palettes. 2 of the 11 completed palettes were from the 7 partial palettes the quarter before. Are we on the same page still? Do we understand where I'm going? I still currently have 11 partial palettes in my collection, which means 11 of the palettes that I have are still in that list of palettes that have been touched but not have been no pan left behind it. And I currently am sitting at 32 of my 207 palettes have been touched entirely, so no pan left behind. That is only 15.5% of my collection that has been no pan left behind it, but 45 of my 207 palettes have been touched entirely, which I think that's a good number. I mean, it could be better. It could be better, but that's almost 25% of my palette collection has been touched this year. And I think that that's honestly more than has been done in the most recent years. Since I stopped doing palette roulette weekly, I don't touch nearly as many palettes in my collection. But when I was doing it weekly, those were the only palettes that were getting touched. New palettes that were coming to me are palettes that were in my collection long term that I hadn't reviewed yet. So I'm really happy to see that I'm touching more than just the palettes that I'm reviewing. And the only reason why I know that to be true is because of this project that I am doing. So let's go through the 11 palettes that I have no pan left behind it in the last 3 months. In no particular order, I have the Unearthly Not Normal palette. Unearthly is a new brand to me, and I think of the 2 palettes that I was utilizing in palette roulette, this maybe is not my favorite, although it is my favorite artwork for the Unearthly palettes that I purchased. But this is the palette. I do love this palette, don't get me wrong, but I just think that it is maybe not a favorite for me because of the color story. It's just not as cohesive as it could be, but I did no pan left behind this. Unearthly is a really fun brand, new to me brand this year, and this palette I was able to complete through no pan left behind. I do think all of these were part of my palette roulette series. The second Unearthly palette that I have in this is Dreamer. This is amazing artwork as well. Probably not my favorite. It is just a little bit gross in my humble opinion. But this palette was stunning. I had such an amazing time using it. Every eye look I created with it is beautiful. This blue is such a beautiful blue. blends really, really well. As a matter of fact, I think I just did a video where it's like, I don't think that I've met a blue in my collection yet that isn't a fickle blue. I do think that that one is not a fickle blue. So I was really, really pleased with this palette. Really, really pleased with Unearthly Cosmetics, honestly. Really super happy to get them in my collection. I also completed the Patrick Star Visionary One Size palette. I think when I reviewed this, I kind of put it into, when I think of my reviews, I think of them in terms of green being amazing palettes, yellow being kind of mediocre palettes, and red being bad palettes, right? Like a stoplight, so that I can rank them all at the end of the year and kind of know a semblance of order that I'd like to keep them in. This one, it isn't necessarily a bad palette, but it isn't my favorite either. And I think it's just because of the color story. Honestly, these colors are pretty fantastic, and I do think that they blend well. I think that it worked really well. I think that it's just a ho-hum kind of color story for me, right? It's a brown is a brown is a brown. There are some little idiosyncrasies with the browns in here that I feel like are unique to my collection, but not unique enough that it makes me like think that this is a stellar rockstar palette. These two shadows over here, this blue and this like kind of periwinkle, were very disappointing. So not a horrible palette, but also not one of my favorites, but I did complete this one. No Pan Left Behind through Palette Roulette as well. I also completed the Melt Fatally Yours No Pan Left Behind. This is a Bailey Sarian collab, and I was super stoked to get this one in my collection because I was like, heck yes, let's do a melt palette that's all matte. I don't love this palette. I love the color story of this palette, but I don't love this palette. I think that the shadows in here are a lot darker on the eye than they appear in the palette. And of the matte formula from Melt that is already kind of fickle and you have to finesse it just so, I feel like these are just a level up of that fickleness and the finesse that you need to have with these shadows to make them work for you. So not my favorite Melt palette, but also not my least favorite Melt palette. I also had the Smoke Sessions 2, which was an amazing palette to use. Again, I used it in my palette roulette. I used it with this palette here, so it did give me all of the shimmers that I needed to partner with that all matte Bailey Sarian palette. Love this palette. I'm super happy to have it in my collection. I also have the Patrick Ta Major Dimension 3 eyeshadow palette, and I think ultimately these are really, really good, but I also think ultimately I was really bummed out by it because I did pick this palette over the Danessa Myricks Groundwork palette, and I just didn't feel like these stepped up in the way that I knew that the Danessa Myricks Groundwork palette would. They're beautiful shadows. They really are beautiful shadows. This black is a fantastic black. I love the cream formulas in here, but honestly, the cream formula of these I felt like were just a little bit less awesome in this palette than they were in his like Major Dimension. I think I have 2. Not unhappy to have this in my collection, but also it isn't a palette that I see in my collection long term, if that makes any sense. I completed the Viseart Pro Dew palette, which is just a little tiny like mini eyeshadow palette. Really beautiful like coral color story. Really great palette for like springtime and maybe even summertime. I would say more summer than spring. I was also able to complete the Urban Decay Electric palette. I did bring this into my deck of panning actually, and that is how I got this done in my collection. This wasn't a palette that I was reviewing, but it was a No Pan Left Behind palette that I brought into deck of panning, and I did end up decluttering this palette into my Makeup Memories drawer because this is the catalyst of my YouTube channel, this palette here, and it doesn't perform like it used to. and it kind of bothers my eyes. So that said, it performed way better than this one, which was brought in at the same time. But because that one bothered my eyes and how old it was, I did decide to declutter that one into my makeup memories drawer, but keep this one because I do love some of these lighter shades for blending out other shadows in my collection. Now, that doesn't mean that this is going to remain in my collection forever. I am going to keep tracking it, and if I am not using it for blend out of some of these like really pigmented, beautiful like colors that are also in this palette that I can use for blending out, then I'm just gonna get rid of this palette because I don't love this palette, this Urban Decay Wired palette, as much as I love the Urban Decay Electric, but the Urban Decay Electric was so old, I felt like it needed to go. But I wasn't going to declutter it to declutter it. It went into my makeup memories drawer. I was also able to complete No Pan Left Behind the Lunar Beauty Nude Prism palette. This is a beautiful, beautiful kind of rosy, pinky toned neutral eyeshadow palette. Or nude eyeshadow palette. I loved this so dang much. The shimmers kind of perform a lot more like Super Shock shadows in that they're a little bit like spongy and more of a cream than they are anything else. I do think that there's a lot of redundancy in like these coppery goldy shades, but such a beautiful palette and I really enjoyed using it. And the most recent, so the one that I was able to No Pan Left Behind by the end of September, within that last week of September, is the Hip Dot Witchy Warms, which is part of my current palette roulette. And this is what it looks like, but I was able to touch every single shadow in this palette. I do think that I just created 2 different eye looks with this and was able to get all of the shadows in this palette used. This is actually kind of a good palette. I'm not going to go into it a whole lot right now because I do have this still currently in my palette roulette, but it was the last one that I was able to complete in the quarter. So again, I did have 11 eyeshadow palettes that I was able to complete in Q3. And I was also able to touch an additional 8 eyeshadow palettes. So I did dip into the Natasha Denona Love Face palette for this shadow here and this shadow here in my Build Your Own palette for the Book of Magic. I did do an eyeshadow look utilizing a Get Ready With Me All Things Natasha Denona and dipped into the Trio Chrome palette. This whole top row was used in this palette. I also have the Natasha Denona Purple Blue and the Natasha Denona Purple Blue. I did utilize this shade right here also in my Build Your Own palette for the Book of Magic. And I'm just now realizing that that deep purple in this one wasn't for the Book of Magic, but I did dip into it for a different look. This purple was used for the Book of Magic, and I did utilize it in an eyeshadow look on camera. You can see that this one is currently not in the palette. That one is in my current fall Build Your Own palette, and I have utilized that too, so that palette will show back up next month. I was also able to dip into, in this third quarter, the Alyssa Edwards palette. I did use this in an eye look for my daughter when we were doing a makeup playtime. She wanted kind of like a sunrisey, sunsetty kind of look. This is the palette that I used for that. This really is just a really great palette for this. Yellow is a fantastic yellow. This white is a fantastic white. So I dipped into this palette for those shadows. I also dipped into the ABH Nervina Volume 3 palette. I used this orange up here in the same eye look that I was creating for my daughter in that makeup playtime that I did with her. And then I have this palette, which I'm not going to open for you, but this one's been touched off and on all dang year long. And there were 4 different shadows in this palette that I utilized in September, and then 2 different shadows that I started utilizing in August in this palette and have since completed in September in this palette. But you guys will see this palette opened up in my next deck of panning. And then for the last 2 palettes of the 8 palettes that are partial palettes, so palettes that I have dipped into but not completed, no pan left behind in this quarter, I have the 2 remaining palettes that are in my palette roulette right now. As of today, I have touched all but this shadow in this palette, which means that it is almost a no pan left behind palette, but it will be no pan left behind for October. And then as of today, in the Mickey and Friends Morphe palette, the only ones that I have touched is this top row here. So that is it in this palette, and it will be completed no pen left behind by the end of this month as well, because it is my palette roulette palette, and it is the only palette that I have left of the 3 palettes that I pulled into this that I need to get the most usage out of. So with that said, that is my no pen left behind update for quarter 3, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I'm really happy to be doing this because it gives me a bigger picture of what is actually going on in my palette collection. And when I look at some of these, like, I'm like, why haven't I just finished these palettes? Like, when I look at the Hypernatural Face palette by Natasha, there's only 3 shadows in here that I need to use, or 4 shadows in here that I need to use before I have no pan left behind in this palette. And then the Tarte Make Believe in Yourself palette, that is one of the palettes that has been on my agenda to utilize the entire year last year, and then again this year. It's been in a lot of my like deck of pannings and whatnot. There's only 3 shadows left in this one to use before it becomes a no pan left behind eyeshadow palette. So I'm just like, why haven't I worked on these? I love doing this because it is a way for me to track and to actually physically see, and not just say, yeah, I think I'm using all my palettes. Like, I know which ones have been touched in my collection and which ones have not. What I need to remember is that I need to quit pulling for the same palettes over and over again. Like, if a palette has been touched for an orange, I need to go to a different palette and grab that palette for an orange. Like, I have a ton of really great shadows in my collection, and I just continue to pull for the same partially used palettes instead of getting them no pen left behind it. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I hope that if you did, you'll give it a big thumbs up. I also hope that you don't forget to comment down in the description box, hit your girl up. It helps me in the algorithm, but I also love just talking to you guys, and I do work a really demanding full-time job, so I am not quick to respond, but I do promise I respond to every single one of the messages that are left for me in my comment section. So please don't forget to hit me up there. I really do like having conversations with you guys. And you guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you all are well. I hope that you are all safe, healthy, and getting along as best you can. I hope that you are all loving each other, being kind humans, and living your best life. And until next time, bye, friends.